So welcome everyone. Welcome to this workshop on Friedrich Heinrich Jacobi. And before introducing our speakers, I'd like to mention some practical matters. First of all, I'm very pleased to see all of you, and it would be very nice if some of you who currently don't have their videos on could switch on their cameras. Of course, it's no obligation, but it might be nice for all of us to see who's in the audience. So as you might know, we have 3 speakers today, each of whom will speak for about 20 minutes. And after each of the papers, Stefan Schlick will give a response. And the speakers will have the opportunity to respond to this response. And after that, we'll have time for Q&A, so everyone will be able to participate in the discussions at that point. As usual, we leave open the Zoom meeting after the formal end. So if you have questions that you are not able to ask, or if you would like to hang on to have a chat or get to know the others, please feel free to stay on after the formal conclusion. So let me first introduce the commentator of today. It's my great pleasure to welcome Professor Stefan Schlick, who is a professor, Schlick, who is a professor at the University of Regensburg. Sorry?
I'm not anymore. I'm in Leipzig right now.
Are you in Leipzig right now? Oh, sorry. I googled you, but I got to on the wrong website. So I'm really sorry about that. So.
Okay. No.
So in Leipzig, but nevertheless, his research is very wide-ranging, and he has published on scholasticism, classical German philosophy, but also classical and contemporary philosophy of law. In particular, he has published widely on Kant, Fichte, Hegel, and of course Jacobi. So I'd like to mention his most recent monograph, which is precisely on Jacobi, and it's titled Die Legitimität der Aufklärung, Selbstbestimmung der Vernunft by Immanuel Kant und Friedrich Heinrich Jacobi. And this work was published in 2019 with Kloosterman. Another very relevant publication I'd like to mention is an article in Hegelstudien, also published in 2019, titled The Spirit of the Age and Reason in History, Herde, Hegel, and Jacobi. So I will leave it at that. And of course, I'm very much looking forward to your comments. So I now turn to our first speaker, Guido Frilli. He's a postdoc researcher at the University of Florence. And he works on Hegel, Jacobi, and early modern philosophy, and in particular early modern political philosophy. He did his PhD at the University of Florence and Université Paris 1, and his thesis is on Hegel and Hobbes, and was published as a book in 2017. His other publications include another monograph, also in Italian, titled L'apparenza saggezza, Machiavelli, Hobbes e la critica del umanesimo, published in 2021. Guido also published various articles on Jacobi, concerned with the idea of intuitive knowledge, self-consciousness, and language. And he currently collaborates on the Jacobi online Wörterbuch, which is part of the new critical edition of Jacobi's works. So the title of Guido's paper is Jacobi and the a priori proof of the existence of God. So let's welcome our first speaker.
Thank you very much for the invitation. I'm really very happy to know you, if just online. And okay, so I'll try with the share screen mode. Let's see if it works. because I have this PowerPoint. Do you still see me on the video? Okay. So I can begin. Yeah, thank you again. So I'll try to stay in the 20 minutes, okay? So the title of my paper is Friedrich Heinrich Jacobi and the a priori proof of the existence of God. And I will directly start reading some quotations of Jacobi, and then I will try to introduce my idea in this paper, which is maybe very rough, but I don't know. I'll give it a try and let's see what happens. My focus, as far as the quotation goes, is on the so-called autobiographical account in the David Hume of 1787, where Jacobi describes his first attempts into philosophy. So we are in the early 60s, and Jacobi just came back to Germany from Switzerland, and is at the beginning of his philosophical studies, and his as far as we are told, his first concern was with the a priori proof of the ontology of the existence of God. And in the David Hume, he says, there, implying in Mendelssohn Morgenstunden, you saw still standing the ancient proof that Descartes had refurbished 100 years earlier, that Leibniz had accepted after a more serious testing, and on which first-rate thinkers still rely with full confidence. You might well have begun to falter at the prospect of acting by your principle in a situation like that. And the I character answers, because David Hume, as you know, is a dialogue between an he and an I. So the I character answers, oh, I took the bull by the horns straight away. So very colorful Jacobian language and very colorful Di Giovanni translation. I began, as I usually do, by tirelessly retracing its historical threads. So the historical threads of the a priori proof of the existence of God. And it is at this time that I became more closely acquainted with the writings of Spinoza. I had read in Leibniz that Spinozism is exaggerated Cartesianism. Spinoza's principle of Cartesian philosophy was known to me, and I remembered from the metaphysical thoughts appended to it what a totally different application the proof of God's existence from the concept receives there from its application in Descartes. I did not possess the opus posthumum, but fortunately I found the ethics at a friend's house among the writings of Wolff. It's here that the Cartesian proof shone forth for me in its full light, so in Spinoza's Ethics. And like 2 pages later, we read the detail of Jacobi's encounter with Kant's Beweisgrund. Kant's writing the only possible ground of proof for demonstration of God. So Kant's essay of 1763. And he says that this essay came to my attention through a journal review. The condescending tone of the review, in which this writing of Kant was there spoken of, did not recommend it much. But that did not prevent me from becoming fully absorbed in it. The propositions and the passages extracted said enough. And here in the 1787 edition of the David Hume, there is this footnote where Jacobi quotes from the only possible ground of Kant, saying that existence is not a predicate or a determination of a thing, but rather is rather the absolute positing of the thing. So this is the first part of Kant's essay. I will come back to it.
Guido, sorry to interrupt, but we still see we saw the first slide. So,
okay.
So we now see the third one. Yeah. So
the third one, you mean?
Yeah. So I think we could not see the quotes you were reading.
Oh, really?
But
What slide are you seeing right now?
Kant's the only possible ground of proof for demonstration of God's existence came to my attention.
Yeah. I was reading from this slide.
Yeah. Okay, but we can only now see it.
Okay.
I don't know why.
Sorry.
Yeah.
Sorry. I don't know. Please tell me if there are further problems. I'll try to.
Oh, and could you put it on full presentation mode?
Is it on full presentation now? Is it on full presentation? Because I put it on full presentation.
It's not on full presentation mode right now.
It is on my computer. Maybe I can try sharing the full screen as I did earlier, not only the PowerPoint page, because maybe the problem is with the PowerPoint page. So I'll just try sharing the full screen. Did you see the presentation now?
Yes.
Okay.
Yeah.
Sorry.
Okay, so please continue.
Yeah. So Jacobi continues. Nor did I regret my impatience. Even the first consideration on existence in general betrayed to me the same man to whom I was so much indebted for his essay on evidence. Kant's essay, the references on Kant is to Kant's essay on evidence on evidence of the principle of moral and theology, which was published like 1 year earlier. The one that had received the honorable mention. As I read on, my joy grew to the point where my heart began to palpitate violently. And before reaching my goal, at the end of the third consideration, I had to pause several times in order to compose myself again in attention. So very enthusiastic, Jacobi, while reading Kant's Beweisgrund. So here are the basic questions of my short paper. What is the proof Jacobi is talking of? And the answer is quite simple, I think. Jacobi is talking of Descartes' a priori demonstration of the existence of God in the fifth metaphysical meditation. So the idea that we can achieve the demonstration of the existence of God starting from the concept of God itself. So we have a concept, and in Descartes' proof, this is the concept of God as a perfect being. And from this concept, we are able to infer God's existence. So why is Jacobi suspicious of Descartes' a priori demonstration? And he's very suspicious of the a priori demonstration since the early beginning of his philosophical career. And I think there are three orders of reason. First, what one could call there are existential reasons for Jacobi's suspicion, because Jacobi thought that the God whose existence is reached through the a priori demonstration is a dead God, is an abstract God. It has nothing to do with the God that whose life, whose spirit we feel in the art. So if we think of Pascal's opposition between the reasons of the art and the reasons of the intellect, I think that Jacobi thinks of something like that. So Descartes' God in the fifth meditation is an only abstract and conceptual God that does not reach man's feeling. There are also there is also a methodological skepticism on Jacobi's part, because Jacobi thinks, in accordance to Kant, I mentioned earlier Kant's essay on the evidence of the principle of theology and morality. Jacobi thinks that the mathematical method employed by Descartes and by Descartes' followers in modern philosophy is not able to reach any true metaphysical truth, any genuine metaphysical truth, because it is an intellectual method aiming only at our subjective constructions, but not at reality itself. And I think these two reasons of Jacobi's skepticism towards Descartes' proof combine into what will become Jacobi's overall critique of modern rationalism, which is both a methodological critique and, so to speak, an existential critique. So I will leave it at that for now, and I will just mention that Hegel's reading of Jacobi in the so-called Vorbegriff to the Encyclopedia Logic, so one of the main points, one of the main texts in which Hegel interprets Jacobi's philosophy. Hegel claims there something that might appear quite surprising if one thinks of Jacobi's suspicion of Descartes' philosophy. Hegel claims there that Jacobi and Descartes express the same position of thought towards objectivity, the position of immediate knowing. So both Jacobi and Descartes, according to Hegel, are representative of immediate knowing. So they think that the metaphysical truths, just like the existence of God, can be reached through some kind of immediate intuition or non-conceptual knowledge. So according to Hegel, there is not the gap between Jacobi and Descartes that Jacobi thinks. And so the very basic point of my paper is to wonder if Hegel's point makes sense at all. So does it make sense to think of Jacobi's suspicion of Descartes, which is a suspicion mostly concerning Descartes' theological rationalism and Descartes' a priori demonstration of the existence of God, is Jacobi's suspicion misplaced, or else Jacobi and Descartes are quite akin to each other? So in this short paper, I will not tell much about the argument itself, but I will look into some what I think its historical background, and I will inquire into some antecedents of Jacobi's view, what I take to be some antecedents of Jacobi's view, which is, to my mind, Kant's Beweisgrund, for textual reasons that I have already illustrated, and maybe two others. I think Fenelon's Traité ou démonstration de l'existence de Dieu, and also Rousseau's Professions of Faith of the Savoyard Vicar. I think today I will only have time to briefly speak about Kant, but I think that that all three philosophers they make a similar point concerning the a priori proof of the existence of God. Namely, very broadly, they discuss and partly rejects Descartes' proof, Descartes' a priori proof. So I think these philosophers as important influences on Jacobi's position, and I think it is quite instructive to dwell on them. To begin with, what is Jacobi's early critique of the a priori proof, as we read it in the as Jacobi exposed it in the David Hume? I'll just state some very basic propositions. So Jacobi says in the David Hume, being is not a property, but what carries all properties, and all properties presuppose one fundamental reality, zum Grunde liegende Realen, or absolute being. What Descartes and Spinoza do, so the main representative of the classical modern theological rationalist position, so Descartes and Spinoza as representative of the a priori demonstration of the existence of God, what they do is that is putting together the concept of God from the representation of its conceptual properties. That is to say, they stipulate a possible God in order to infer its existence from its conceptual possibility. But this inference, Jacobi claims, can only be true on the basis of that disputable stipulation. So Jacobi claims one cannot infer God's existence from God. One can deduce God's existence from God's concept only if one starts from an abstract concept. But the point is that being, including God's being, is not a property, so it's not a concept. And now, if we look at Kant's Beweisgrund, the first part, I think we find many similar points. And I'll just indicate some. So, according to Kant, the most important of all our cognitions, that there is a God, owes nothing to the conceptual knowledge or rational demonstration, but is already present in the natural common sense, Kant says. The reference is to the Akademie-Ausgabe. The basic concepts of metaphysics, including that of existence or being, cannot be either known or deduced through the mathematical method of synthesis. They are already given in immediate certainty and can only be analyzed or partially clarified, Kant claims. And among these concepts, existence, which is one of the most important, Kant also makes other examples like representation and space, but let's focus on existence. Existence is not a predicate. Remember Jacobi saying being is not a property. Existence is not a predicate. Predicates, that is, the logical determinations of the properties of a thing, are relative positions, while existence is the absolute position of a thing. This is the famous thesis of Kant's Beweisgrund. As such, existence cannot be defined, explained, or deduced on the basis of conceptual predicates. It has to be attested independently of any conceptual determination. What predicates do is to determine the possibility of a thing, as well as its relative position in the net of causal and logical interconnection with all other possible things in the world, what Leibniz would call the compossibility of things. Kant does not employ this concept in the Beweisgrund. But only the existence posits the absolute actuality, Wirklichkeit, of a thing. Hence, the existence of a thing can never be inferred from its logical possibility. And lastly, the possibility of a thing, insofar as it is not only logical possibility or non-contradiction, but supplies us with some material to think and determine, presupposes something existent. From this it follows that all possibility is given in something actual, etwas Wirklichem, either in it as a determination or through it as a consequence, Kant claims. And this is the Realgrund, or the zum Grunde liegende Dasein of a thing. So, the first thing to notice is the glaring affinity between Kant's Realgrund in this essay and Jacobi's zum Grunde liegende Reale. It is important to say that, of course, I'm not the only one to remark the influence of Kant's Beweisgrund on Jacobi. One can think of Dieter Henrich and Manfred Frank, or more recently Paolo Olivieri. But I think that more research is needed on this topic. So I think it's a good idea to inquire this influence a bit further. I think that for both Kant and Jacobi, Dasein, I mean the Kant of the Beweisgrund, Dasein is ontologically and epistemically prior with respect to all conceptual account of properties. And this is a quotation from Kant: until you prove the possibilities through the principle of contradiction, you still rely on what is given as a thinkable in a thing, and you consider it but its connection with respect of this logical rule. But in the end, if you reflect on how this thinkable is given, you can resort to anything except its Dasein. The Dasein of God, this is something Kant says in the last part of the Beweisgrund. The Dasein of God cannot be deduced from concepts, as Descartes and Spinoza did with the a priori demonstration. And this involves, Kant insists, that the non-existence of God is not contradictory, contrarily to what Descartes and Spinoza thought. Rather, the existence of God is felt or perceived by sound common sense, and in particular, God as spirit, that is, as an intelligent and willing being, is grasped through an immediate judgment of intelligence, Kant says, ein unmittelbares Urteil des Verstandes. In this connection, recall Jacobi's famous dictum in the Spinoza Briefe: the goal of philosophy is to discover and reveal existence, Dasein zu enthüllen und zu offenbaren, and conceptual explications are only means to achieve the revelation of existence, of Dasein. Very quick. So, according to Kant, there is the possibility of an ontological proof of the existence of God, which, however, has to take another form with respect to Descartes and Spinoza. And this form in the Beweisgrund essay is something like a modal conditional reasoning. So Kant says, as I understand it, maybe I'm wrong, but Kant seems to say, if for something to be possible at all, there must be an absolutely necessary being in which this possibility is grounded or by which it is caused. For spiritual beings such as we are, in particular, there must be a spiritual real Grund as their creator. So, albeit God's non-existence can be thought without formal contradiction, it cannot be thought without a material impossibility, that is, without annihilating every possibility and every thinkable. And this is the question I would like to address. Does Jacobi share Kant's revised ontological argument? Or does he only endorse the idea that God's Dasein can but be immediately perceived in inner feeling without any possible conceptual articulation? So my point is, I think that Jacobi is, as Jacobi himself tells us, Jacobi is very much influenced by Kant's Beweisgrund essay, but to which extent? So a very manifest influence is that Jacobi thinks that the Dasein cannot be reached through conceptual articulation, but it has to be immediately perceived. And another influence is that Jacobi thinks that the perception of Dasein is ontologically and epistemically prior with respect to the conceptualization of properties of a thing. But does he also share Kant's ontological argument? Well, the answer is controversial, but my idea is that he does share Kant's revised argument, although he does not formulate it as formally as Kant does in the Beweisgrund. Take, for example, the last part of the David Hume. I will read this quotation, but there are many possible quotations in Jacobi's writings concerning this point. What we call matter borders on nothing because of its unsubstantial divisibility in infinitum. What is a body? An organic body. It is all nothing, a non-entity, and without a hint of substantial permanence, unless we think of form through substance and first posit a kingdom of spirits. It is nothing unless we start from the absolutely simple nature of life. So every system requires a spirit that unifies it, moves it, and holds it together, a Lord and a King of life, and so on. So my point is that in this place, Jacobi's reasoning, like Kant's, is based on the evidence of the material impossibility of the non-existence of a spiritual real Grund. Once something possible is given to think and to account for. The non-existence of God would imply the annihilation of all determinate existence, which would be reduced to a sheer fiction of dream. And incidentally, I think that this is also very important for Jacobi's overall conception of nihilism, especially in the later Brief und Fichte. And the fact is that Kant's Beweisgrund is supposed to be an ontological and a priori proof. It is critical of Descartes, but it is not an unqualified rejection of Descartes' a priori proof. I think this is best showed by the fact that it is a development of a proof that is already introduced by Leibniz, most clearly in the paragraph 43 to 46 of Monadology, if you go and check it. And for Leibniz, this modal argument, so very briefly, from a possibility of a thing to its to the existence of a necessary being, is not at odds with Descartes' proof, even if it is not strictly a priori in the sense of Descartes' fifth meditation. So Leibniz conceives of it as the refinement of an argument that Descartes states in the responsiones to the first and second objections concerning the fifth meditation. So if Jacobi reiterates Kant's and Leibniz's argument, and recall that the David Hume is openly influenced by Leibniz's metaphysics of monads, then his philosophy is by no means unrelated to these key developments of the modern rationalistic metaphysics. So I have no time to speak of Fenelon. Just to conclude, I think that Hegel's point in the Vorbegriff is exaggerated, but it is not completely mistaken or misplaced. There is indeed a kinship that can be also historically reconstructed between Descartes and Jacobi on the question of the a priori proof on the existence of God. So thank you.
Okay, thank you very much. So I now turn over to Stefan Schick.
Okay, thank you so much for this really inspiring and eye-opening talk, which I really found interesting. So just one thing, you didn't talk about Fenelon, but I was wondering, I remember that in the Fenelon book of Spähmann, there is a passage on Jacobi. So this was one thing I was remembering, whether you know it or. And the other thing, which is also only a short question, you said that the ontological argument by Descartes expresses the most radical and controversial claims of modern rationalism on the whole. So I was wondering, of course, the ontological argument is much older than Descartes. We know it from Anselm of Canterbury. So it would be just very interesting to hear if you think that there is some striking difference between the ontological argument as it is given by Anselm and as it given by Descartes, which makes the Cartesian argument explicitly modern rationalistic argument, whereas the argument as it is given by Anselm of Canterbury is not modern in this sense. This would be kind of interesting for me. And then now to the main point. I mean, one might think that Jacobi's recourse to Kant might be kind of strategical too, because there was this argument with the Berlin Enlighteners, and they wanted to have Kant on their side. And later Kant would also, I mean, he's not really with them, but he's more against Jacobi than he is against Mendelssohn. So one might think perhaps there are also some strategic reasons. And of course, there are many similarities, but as Plato once said, similarity is a slippery genus. And so we have to be careful, I think. So if we reconsider the Kantian argument, it's like, okay, if there would be nothing existing, then there would be nothing thinkable. Because if, and with the thinkable logical possibility would be annihilated. And because logical possibility concerns only the connection of a subject and a predicate, and if there is, and both the subject, the content of the subject and the content of the predicate must be thinkable or must be a thought, and this thought must somehow be given. And so judgments at all wouldn't be possible without any content, and this content must be posited in an all real being. And then we can also give some things which this being must entail, like personality, it must be a vital or vivid or living being, and so on. But so the interesting thing is, Kant, he goes out from the possibility of a judgment. But if we look at the David Hume, then Hume says, oh, if we would only be judging beings, we would never be able to argue for realism, and we would never have any idea of being at all. We only have an idea of being because we are acting beings, because we are somehow in contact with the world. We set our ends, and then there is the world, and the world, I don't know, somehow presents resistance to us. We have to overcome this resistance. So first of all, we have to be acting beings, and judgments in a way are secondary to actions. First comes the action, and then comes the judgment. And so being for Jacobi is, I think, from the beginning, more a practical notion than it is, and it's only a notion for judgments in a derived sense. And so is, and then this is, I think, also true for how they conceptualize being. For Kant, it's only the position of predicates. For Jacobi, it's much more like individuality or personality. When he writes to his friend Jean-Paul, personality is the fundamentals of all my philosophy. Individuality is the fundamental notion of my philosophy. And even the quotation you gave in the end is also on only living beings are real beings at all, because that which is not that which is not living is not a real individual and can be divided in ad infinitum in a way. And so I think the concept of being is completely different between Kant and Jacobi on the other hand, because for Kant it's just the position of predicates, and for Jacobi it's a practical notion. It's my experience as being an individual. And I think the end, which you quoted, where he said the spirit which lies outside, isn't this more a critique of an idea of the nous of the world, considered as a world soul, which he finds, for example, I think, at least in his interpretation, in Giordano Bruno, which he also quotes in his second edition of the Spinoza letters. So I think this quotation has not so much to do with Kant, but more with a concept of the spirit of the world, which is not a trans or a supra-mundane concept of spirit, but where spirit is just the form of the matter of the world, as I think he understood Giordano Bruno. So it's not supposed these things to be an argument against you or a critique. It's just some things I was wondering whether you have an idea on it. But your paper was fantastic, so thank you again.
So I have to answer now, right? Okay. I don't know if I'm able. I will try. Yes, I forgot to mention the Spemann book on where he speaks of Jacobi and Fenelon. But generally, it seems to me that this is a quite undervalued connection. I think more research is needed on this topic, because Jacobi's Fenelon's influence on the last on the mature thought of Jacobi is palpable. I think there are many connections that could be made, and also the point I made in the paper and not in the speech on Fenelon and Malebranche and the view, the so-called simple view existence of God. I think there are things there as well to look on, because differently from Kant, which as you rightly stressed, as a much more logical conception of existence with respect to Jacobi, Fenelon and Malebranche, they emphasize rather the direct living presence of God in man's heart, and there is also Pascal behind, and so on. So I think that's maybe my idea, my very broad idea on the Jacobi-Descartes connection concerning the ontological proof would be stronger on the side of Fenelon, and maybe also of Rousseau, because I think that your points on Kant are valuable. I agree. I cannot say if Jacobi's quotation of Kant, enthusiastic quotation of Kant in the David Hume of the Beweisgrund is strategic, or to what point is it strategic? Partly it is indeed, because Jacobi is a strategic writer, and especially in the context of the dispute against Mendelssohn and the Aufklärer, the Berlin Aufklärer, and so on. I tend to think that there is more than that, and I agree that Kant's argument in the Beweisgrund points at the nature of judgment, while Jacobi's one in the David Hume and also in the Spinoza-Briefe and elsewhere does not. But if you look, for example, at the second part of the Beweisgrund, where Kant develops the idea of a physico-theological proof of the existence of God, and he speaks of order and beauty of the world, I think this is also important for Jacobi. And taking the Beweisgrund on the whole, I don't think that the impression that Jacobi could get of it while reading in the 60s was that of an only logical critique of Wolff and the rationalist metaphysics of his time. I think what Jacobi grasped of the idea of Dasein in Kant had much to do with what he says in the Spinoza-Brief about the discovery and revelation of Dasein as a goal of a philosopher. Is there priority of action over judgment in Jacobi? Yes, I have no intention to question that. My point is more limited. Is on the concept of existence and of the existence of God. I don't think that Jacobi is a Kantian in the sense of Kant's Beweisgrund of the pre-critical Kant. Of course, he's not a Kantian in the sense of the critical Kant, but neither it is of the pre-critical Kant. I think that Kant's evidence essay and Kant's Beweisgrund, though, make points that Jacobi endorses and that contribute to shaping his thinking. But I agree, Jacobi would not state the argument giving a priority to judgment and to the logical connection as Kant does. Kant is a much more logically oriented mind with respect to Jacobi. So I don't know if the point on Descartes and the ontological proof. I don't know if I can answer to that. There are many books on that, starting from Dieter Henrich. To my mind, there is something modern in Descartes' rephrasal of the ontological argument. It's not the same as it was in Anselm. There are things in between, starting from the critique of Thomas to Anselm's concept of existence. I think that, of course, Descartes wants to rephrase and validate Anselm's ontological argument, but the specificity of its argument is that we have to start from a concept, so from a clear and distinct concept. so we have to, so to speak, build a mathematical deduction which begins with a concept and ends with existence. So I think that on this score, Kant and Jacobi are right in criticizing, in emphasizing Descartes' mathematical imprint in formulating the ontological problem. We start from a concept and we deduce. This is something. This might be an only methodological point with respect to Anselm, but I think it's important.
Okay, so maybe we can conclude this part here.
Yeah.
So thank you very much, Guido, and also Stefan, of course, for the comments. So we now turn to our second speaker, Wailem Vo. She's a PhD student at the University of Leuven, and in particular working with me, which is a great pleasure. And the topic of her PhD thesis is Jacobi's idea of God. And before coming to Leuven, Wailem taught music and religious studies in Hong Kong, and she also obtained her BA degree in Hong Kong. So her paper today is on Jacobi and Hemsterhuis on fatalism, atheism, and Spinozism.
Is the PowerPoint okay for everyone? Good. Okay, so I will. So thanks to Professor Karine Dubois for this introduction. So in the first edition of the Letters on Spinoza, Jacobi claims that Spinozism is fatalism when he writes, the whole thing comes down to this. From fatalism, I immediately conclude against fatalism and everything that is connected with it. In the later parts of the same letters, however, Jacobi identifies Spinozism as atheism. Jacobi himself does not clearly explain the connection between these two claims. This leads to the question as to why Jacobi characterizes Spinoza's philosophy as both fatalist and atheist, especially when these two terms seem to contradict each other. Fatalism, as commonly understood, is the idea that our fate is predetermined by some supernatural or superhuman forces, such as God. Whereas atheism is the idea that there is no God. How then is it possible for Jacobi to attribute both fatalism and atheism to Spinoza's philosophy? In Grund und Ursache, Birgit Sandkallen points out that fatalism and atheism are two typoi that Jacobi gives to Spinoza's philosophy. The type of fatalism, however, plays a more important role in Sandkallen's analysis because, in her view, the salto mortale that Jacobi mentions in the Letters on Spinoza is a jump out of fatalism. Besides Sandkallen, Emanuel Bauer has also carried out an extensive analysis of how, according to Jacobi, Spinoza's philosophy amounts to fatalism. However, both Sandkallen and Bauer do not explain why, in Jacobi's view, Spinozism is atheist as well. So in my presentation, I am going to explain the connection among fatalism, atheism, and Spinozism in Jacobi's Letters on Spinoza by paying special attention to the influence of Francois Hemsterhuis in Jacobi's philosophy. This is for two reasons. First of all, Jacobi often quotes from Hemsterhuis's works in the Letters on Spinoza. Secondly, Hemsterhuis wrote the Letter on Fatalism in 1776, and the Letter on Atheism in 1787. So this means that Hamsterhuis carried out systematic reflections on the ideas of fatalism and atheism. While there is no evidence suggesting that Jacobi read Hamsterhuis's Letter on Fatalism, he did read the Letter on Atheism. Jacobi even offered his own German translation of Hamsterhuis's Letter on Atheism and included it in the second edition of the Letters on Spinoza. So in my presentation, I argue that an understanding of Hamsterhuis's views on fatalism and atheism contributes to a better understanding of Jacobi's claim that Spinoza's philosophy is both fatalist and atheist. Accordingly, my presentation is going to be in 4 parts. So first of all, I am going to explain Hamsterhuis's and Jacobi's conception of fatalism. The third part concentrates on Hamsterhuis's ideas on atheism, in particular, the third kind of atheism in this letter. Finally, I turn to relevant passages in the Letters on Spinoza and explain how Jacobi draws a connection among fatalism, atheism, and Spinozism. So the first part. The Letter on Fatalism is one of Hamsterhuis's unpublished works that is not included in the current critical edition. Hamsterhuis begins this letter by defining the idea of fate as the necessity we attribute to the relation between two events, one following the others. As we can see from the quote, just as we see the relation from the past to the present, they appear to follow each other necessarily. And we assume the same necessary relation from the present to the future. Hamsterhuis argues that the idea of fate finds its origin in 2 sources. The first one is the idea of a necessary whole in which the past, the present, and the future are merely the modifications of one single universal event. Hamsterhuis calls this necessary whole the God of Spinoza. The second source is the idea of a supreme being that exists necessarily by its nature. And by its omnipotence, this supreme being created the entire universe. Hamsterhuis called this second perspective the system of the orthodoxes. And in the Letter on Fatalism, Hamsterhuis argues that both of these systems are problematic. And here is the argument offered by Hamsterhuis. First of all, Hamsterhuis refers to an earlier letter that he wrote to Princess Galitzin. And the letter he refers to is the Letter on Man and His Relations. In this letter, Hamsterhuis argues for the reality of the human will. He points out that human beings have always been making plans about their future and act accordingly in order to achieve their purposes. In doing so, they seek to assert their influence on the future as much as their human capacity allows them to. This inclination to assert one's influence on his own future through the use of his willpower is often so strong that it would be totally useless to convince a person about the reality of fate. So as Hamsterhuis writes, for those people who have such a conviction, either by clear reasoning or by an inner sentiment of the reality of his will, there cannot be any fate. So Princess Galitzin read this letter, and she found Hamsterhuis's arguments insufficient. She asked Hamsterhuis whether there is any argument against fatalism that is not based on the reality of the human will. Hamsterhuis agrees with the princess's comment, and he points out that one does not destroy a system by proving a contrary one, but instead one overthrows a system only by removing it from the very foundation. End of quote. Thus, Hamsterhuis subsequently provides other arguments against fatalism that is not based on the reality of the free will. And he does so by attacking two claims made by the fatalist. So first of all, Hamsterhuis summarizes the fatalist arguments as follows. A cause is a cause only when it produces an effect. And an effect is an effect only when there is a cause of it. Since cause and effect cannot exist without the other, they must coexist. Against this reasoning, Hamsterhuis uses the example of subtraction. And for the purpose of clarity, I have replaced Hamsterhuis's plus A and minus B with plus 1 and minus 1. So when I subtract 1 from plus 1, the result is 0. The number 0 in this case is produced as the effect of the subtraction. However, before the subtraction happens, plus 1 and minus 1 are totally different numerical values. So in this case, it would be absurd for Hamsterhuis to say that plus 1 and minus 1 coexist. And therefore, the fatalist claim that cause and effect coexist does not really stand. In Hamsterhuis's view, the fatalist claim that cause and effect necessarily coexist is based on an unclear conception of the word cause. He uses the example of two balls colliding with each other to explain his viewpoint. So when we see the first ball moving towards the second one, we expect the second ball to move away from the first one. And it happens just as we expected. When we are asked about the cause of the second ball's movement, we say that it is the first ball. However, the real cause of the movement of the second ball, as Hamsterhuis claims, is the force that is generated in the second ball when the first one hits it. Therefore, the cause does not lie in the first ball, but in the relation between the two balls at the moment they hit each other. This relation produces the effect of the second ball moving away from the first one. Through this example, Hamsterhuis argues, and I quote, "The cause of the effect, properly speaking, is the relation between that which produces and that which is produced." This is to say, the true cause of an event does not reside only in one thing, in the thing that produces it, but also in the other thing on which the effect is produced. So after clarifying the meaning of the word cause, Hamsterhuis goes on to attack the claim that there is a necessary relation between the present and the future. Here, Hamsterhuis points out that the future, unlike the past and the present, remains undetermined as long as it is still in the future. As I mentioned, Hamsterhuis considers the cause of an event as a relation. If the cause of a future event resides only in the present moment, then the fatalists are correct. And in this case, Hamsterhuis says that we have the philosophical position called absolute fatalism. And in this case, a future event would definitely happen as it is in the present moment. However, if the true cause of a future event is derived from the relation between the present and the future remains unknown, then there is no reason for us to assume that it will definitely happen, as long as the future is not yet determined. So finally, Hamsterhuis points out that if we accept the fatalist claims, then there is no possibility for us to assert our influence on the future. What remains from humankind, as I quote from Hamsterhuis, is the God of the deep and unhappy Spinoza. Against the conclusion of the fatalist, Hamsterhuis argues for the freedom of human beings to shape their own future by appealing to God's existence. God, as Hamsterhuis claims, knows all the events of the past, present, and future, and also all the possible events that might have happened, but did not actually happen. Here, I take Hamsterhuis to suggest that beyond the events that have already happened and so are known to us, there is a vast field of possibilities where human beings can create their own state of possibilities with the freedom that God has given them. So I myself consider Hamsterhuis' position as more hopeful than that of the fatalist. And now Jacobi's conception of fatalism. In the letters on Spinoza, Jacobi discusses fatalism in two passages. The first one is a conversation with Lessing, which Jacobi claimed to have taken place in July 1780. The second passage is an imaginary dialogue between Spinoza and Hamsterhuis's Aristide. And for this dialogue, it is Jacobi's composition as part of his response to Hamsterhuis's comments on Spinoza. So in this part, I will focus on Jacobi's conversation with Lessing because the discussion on fatalism is more elaborate in this passage. According to Jacobi, Spinoza's philosophical system rests entirely on the principle that nothing is made out of nothing. He argues that Spinoza rejects the concept of becoming because it implies that before something comes into existence, we must presuppose nothing in the first place. This contradicts the principle nothing comes out of nothing. Consequently, Spinoza, as Jacobi understands, rejects the concepts of change, transition, and secondary causes. Jacobi goes on to explain that since Spinoza rejects the idea of transition and becoming, he must also reject the idea of an emanating cause of the universe. Thus, in Jacobi's view, Spinoza has no other option than to posit an immanent cause of the world in which all effects are one and the same as the cause itself. In Jacobi's interpretation of Spinoza, the infinite cause of the world cannot have an object of thought or of will outside of it, since it is entirely immanent. It follows that in Spinoza's system, the infinite cause of the world does not have an intellect or will. Thus, Jacobi argues that Spinoza rejects the idea of final causes because without the faculty of will, the infinite cause of the world cannot will an object, nor can it act according to a goal. For Jacobi, Spinoza's rejection of the will and the concept of final causes means that his philosophy is essentially fatalistic. An immanent cause of the world that has neither a will nor an object of will cannot act freely. Such denial of freedom is precisely what Jacobi takes to be the central doctrine of fatalism. In order to overcome Spinoza's fatalistic doctrines, Jacobi holds that one must attack Spinozism at its very foundation. The strategy that he employs is to use fatalism against fatalism itself. And he argues for his viewpoint by several examples. So according to Jacobi, if we accept Spinoza's theory that there is no transition and no final cause, then we cannot speak of the inventor of a clock as an inventor. What he does is simply witnessing the mechanical process in which the various elements of a clock coming together. In the same way, we cannot speak of the great painter Raphael as having produced the masterpiece called the School of Athens. We cannot claim also that Lessing wrote Nathan the Wise. But instead, we must say that all these paintings and great works come to be because of some blind force that we do not know of. And in this case, our actions are being determined by some unknown forces, and that is an element of fatalism according to Jacobi. So Jacobi goes on further to say that in this case, we only believe that we have acted out of anger, love, magnanimity, or out of rational decision, while in fact this belief is a mere illusion. Therefore, Jacobi writes that if we follow Spinoza's theory, we will arrive at the conclusion that what fundamentally moves us in all these cases is something that knows nothing of all that. So this is what Jacobi takes to be the elements of fatalism in Spinoza's philosophy. So very quickly, Hamsterhuis's concept of atheism. So in the letters on atheism, Hamsterhuis explained 3 kinds of atheism. The first one refers to the time when human beings turn away from the inner sentiment of awe or fear towards the divine and seek to know the structure of the world by forming the concept of matter. When this concept of matter is formed, there is no need for the divine to be the ultimate explanation of the universe. The gods that human beings once formed in their own image become objects of ridicule. The second kind of atheism is the distortion of religion for political purposes. The rulers took over religion to establish and strengthen their authority over the people. So my focus will be on the third kind of atheism. So according to Hamsterhuis, the third kind of atheism is born out of, I quote, the vanity of the triumphant intellect, end of quote. Hamsterhuis begins the story of this kind of atheism with Descartes, who seeks to destroy previous philosophies and start a new one. His attempt is so successful that, I quote, everybody felt proud to be able to do philosophy as they liked, thus giving birth to this ambiguous and volatile atheism, which, lending itself to anything, makes us see at will, under the same figure, a chaos or a god. At the same time, human beings rediscover geometry, which the people in the ancient times had already practiced. When scientists such as Kepler, Newton, and Huygens apply the method of geometry to physics, they prove their laws in matter itself. In this regard, they surpass the people in the first kind of atheism who had only formed the concept of primal matter. But for the people in the first kind of atheism, they did not know the laws of the universe yet. In the third kind of atheism, geometry shows to human beings a world that is regular, mechanical, and fully explainable by mathematical laws. Hemsterhuis continues the story by describing how the successors of Newton surpassed their predecessors by their process of reasoning. If the laws of gravity, attraction, movements, and force discovered by Newton are applicable to matter, and if they always produce the same effects, then it is obvious that everything we encounter in this world is matter. So unlike the Asians in the first kind of atheism, the human beings at this third stage possess more refined concepts and mental tools for their reflection. While the Asians had only a vague concept of primal matter, the modern man has a clearer and more distinct idea of it. Physics and geometry take the place of the divine and pose themselves as capable of offering the ultimate explanations of the world.
So Marlene, can you try to maybe come to your conclusion?
Okay. I will summarize it a bit. So in this quotation, Hemsterhuis is offering a solution to all these atheism. But for the third kind of atheism, Hemsterhuis says that there is no cure, except when human beings realize that matter is just matter. It is not God. So as long as we are not attributing to matter what more than what properly belongs to it, then we can avoid this atheism. But in the modern times, it will be very difficult to do so. So finally, how does Jacobi relate Spinozism with fatalism and atheism after all these discussions on Hemsterhuis? So in a letter to Jacobi, Hemsterhuis makes the following remark on Spinoza, and that is Spinoza has confused the formula method of geometry with its spirit. So by this, Hemsterhuis means that Spinoza has applied the method of geometry to the metaphysical realm, while such method should only be applicable to the physical realm alone. And in response to Hemsterhuis' remarks, Jacobi writes, what distinguishes Spinoza's philosophy from all the others is the principle, nothing comes out of nothing. So the central problem of the entire system of Spinoza lies in the presupposition of this principle. So Jacobi does not really consider the geometrical method of Spinoza as the central problem, but the principle that nothing comes out of nothing. Because of this principle, Spinoza must posit an immanent cause of the world, and that is nature itself instead of God. So this is, I take Jacobi to mean that Spinoza is taking nature as God. And according to Hemsterhuis' definition of the third kind of atheism, Spinozism would fit into this category. So finally, according to Jacobi, Spinozism is fatalism because it denies final causes and free will. Spinozism is atheism because it posits an immanent cause of the world. And in doing so, Spinoza equates the world itself with God. Thank you very much for listening to my presentation, and I welcome all comments and questions from you.
Okay, thank you, Wailem, for this very clear presentation. So I hand over to Stefan Schick.
So thank you very much for this wonderful presentation. I now came to realize that I should read Hamsterhuis, which I didn't do yet. So thanks for this. Some questions. So first, you said that it seems to be weird that Jacobi accuses Spinoza of atheism and at the same time of fatalism, because if atheism, then no supernatural forces. But isn't there an idea of fatalism which is perfectly fine with not supposing any supernatural forces, which just is the denial of any contingentia futura, what would be future contingencies, so that anything that happens in the future is not possible, but is necessary. Either it happens, then it was necessary that it happened, or it doesn't happen, then it was impossible. This is what what Aristotle tried to overcome with his idea of possibility and potentiality. So I think this seems just fine, because in Spinoza, at least as Jacobi understands Spinoza, there is no real possibility, because anything is necessary. And so because of the denial of future contingencies, we can say it's fatalism. So this would be kind of okay, it seems to me. The other thing with the letter on fatalism, it seems to be kind of clear that Jacobi didn't know it, because if we read the letters he wrote to the Fürsten of Galitzin and Heinze on Hamsterhuis, he mentions all the manuscripts he has which are not published. There is one Simon, I don't know this writing, but it seems to be of Hamsterhuis, and Aristide, the letter something on love, and the letter sur l'homme, the rapport, and sur le désir. So he mentions all the papers he has from, and especially the manuscripts he has from or by Hamsterhuis, but he never mentions this letter on fatalism.
Yes.
So I would rather assume that he didn't know it than just we don't know that he, if he knew it, it seems to be clear that he didn't know it to me. Otherwise, I think he would have mentioned it once in a while. But so the most interesting connection, one thing which is very interesting, so it's just an annotation, that Hamsterhuis speaks of the unhappy Spinoza, and Jacobi does quite the opposite. He says, oh, he wished to have this happy heaven in his mind, and he speaks in Wieder Mendelssohn's Beschuldigungen, he speaks of the happy Spinoza, glückseligen Spinoza. So he thinks of Spinoza as a very happy person, and he always says, oh, he's a theoretical atheist, but he's not a practical atheist. So in his ethics, so not his ethics as a writing, but his ethics he lived, he was kind of, he would say he was a theisimus. He was, he only denied him in theoria. So it seems to be quite different from Hamsterhuis. And the other thing which would be really interesting, and I would like to hear more from you about it, that what is their concept of cause? Because in a way, Jacobi says that Spinoza doesn't really have a notion of cause, but turns causality, which is something real, into a logical connection of ground. So it's not really a cause, Spinoza's God, it's the ground of everything, and it's just a logical ground, which is, or a logical reason, which is in a way identical with all its consequences. And then against this, he puts this idea of cause, which can only be, or first and foremost, experienced by us ourselves, because we experience ourselves as acting beings. We would have no, and I think this is what he also says against Kant, we would have no notion of cause at all if we wouldn't be acting human beings. And so, in a way, any kind of determinism always has this issue that it puts this notion of causality propose a very strong notion of causality, but it cannot have any notion of causality because causality can only be gained by acting causes as we are. And so God must also be a cause which is in a way different from the world. So what would you say about this notion, Jacobi's notion of causality and Hemsterhuis' concept of causality, and then this idea of Jacobi that Spinoza didn't really have a notion of causality or reduced causality to reason and consequence? Thank you.
Okay, thank you very much for your questions. So first of all, concerning the concept of fatalism, I must admit that it was after I read Hemsterhuis' letter on fatalism that I came to realize that at the time of Jacobi and Hemsterhuis, there were different understandings and conceptions of fatalism. So one branch, well, as Hemsterhuis mentions as well, one branch is to assume that there is a supernatural force governing our fate. This is in Greek mythology as well. So in Greek mythology, there is a goddess of fate that weaves the threads of human life. Hemsterhuis was a scholar of ancient Greek culture. So Hemsterhuis must have taken over this idea from ancient Greek mythology and present this view that one way to explain the idea of fate is precisely that we assume a divine being, a supreme being that governs our lives. And another way to understand fatalism is just by looking at the mechanical nature of the world itself, that if things happen in the past in this way, then it is going to be the same in the future. So I would say that it requires further research as to how the philosophers at the time of Jacobi and Hemsterhuis viewed fatalism in different ways. So I admit that there might be other conceptions of it. As for the second question, the letter on fatalism, I tried looking for Jacobi's library of it. I checked the list of books that he had, and the letter on fatalism was not in the list. So I know that Jacobi had not read the letter, and he didn't even know that there is such a letter. So it interests me because Hemsterhuis had done some systematic reflections on the idea of fatalism, and Jacobi wrote something about fatalism in the letters on Spinoza. And it is precisely because I know that Jacobi had not read Hemsterhuis' letter that I want to see if they share some common grounds on their idea, on their understanding of fatalism. So finally, the concept of causality. Hemsterhuis himself has a very clear and systematic reflection on the concept, but for Jacobi, I still need to read Birgit Sandkauler's groundbreaking book, Grund und Ursache. I am confident that I would be able to answer this question better after reading her book from cover to cover. But from what I have read from Jacobi so far, I have the impression that Jacobi takes the concept of cause as in the way we would use it in our everyday life, like when the two balls hit each other, then we attribute the cause to the first ball, and we say that it is the first ball that causes the other one to move away. And Jacobi simply takes this everyday usage as the true meaning of cause. Whereas in Spinoza, it is not really possible for us to use the word cause in its usual sense. And I think this is Jacobi's critique of Spinoza.
Okay, so let's thank our speaker and also the commentator. and we can pursue the conversation later on, hopefully. So we now turn to our final speaker, Juliana Mattone. She graduated at the University of Sao Paulo, and she received her PhD from the University of Sao Paulo as well, but combined with the University of Parma. And her PhD thesis is titled Jacobi, the Natural History of Speculative Philosophy. And she deals, among other things, with Jacobi's conception of the meaning of philosophy itself. Juliana is also the translator of Jacobi's Concerning the Doctrine of Spinoza in Letters to Sir Maurice Mendelssohn into Portuguese. And I believe that the translation was published very recently, somewhere this year. So congratulations on this achievement. The title of her talk today is Moral Sense and Decorum, Jacobi's Ethics Between Cicero and the British Enlightenment.
Thank you very much, Professor De Boer, and thank you all for being here and for listening to me. My English is a bit rusty, but I think I can manage it. I just send you, I'm sorry because I forgot to send it earlier, but I send you the handout for my talk. So I don't know if I can send it here by Zoom, or I send you in an email.
So Juliana, can you try to put it in the chat?
Yeah, I will try. It's a PDF, so you can follow me a little bit better. Excuse me, and I'll try. Yeah, I think it worked. Yes, I think so. Did you receive it?
Yes.
Okay. So thank you very much for this opportunity. And yes, the translation was just released this month, actually. So I'm really happy because it's a way that to the Portuguese-speaking people that can actually read Jacobi, not only things about Jacobi. So I will talk about today. I will talk about the moral sense and decorum. And actually, I would like to say that Jacobi's ethics is hardly or really not really often one of the main research topics when it comes to his philosophical thinking, although it was his main concern in everything he wrote and thought. And I would also like to say that the reader acquainted with Jacobi's works knows that his writings are actually rhapsodic and intentionally lacks a systematic outline. So this is my interpretation. The reader must be even more attentive. He must be able to connect ideas and interpret concepts in a manner not at all obvious. And I think this is one of the difficulties that one can find reading Jacobi, although he writes really well, according to my opinion. And this is what I intend to do now. I will focus on two extracts of two different texts, which give us a great starting point to examine what could be Jacobi's understanding on ethics and his main influences on this subject. This is an exercise, and this was one of the topics of my thesis, where I try to do this relation, to build this relation between Cicero, British Enlightenment, and Jacobi's own ideas. Well, these two texts that I'm going to comment today are Concerning Man's Freedom, published in the second edition of Spinoza Letters, and the dialogue between two characters, Voldemar and Sidney, in the 1796 edition of the romance Voldemar. The first text points to a Stoic conception of the so-called feeling of honor or honesty, depending on the translation. In German, Jacobi writes Gefühl der Ehre. And the second text shows the role of the British Enlightenment in Jacobi's moral understanding. And how, as I said, I will try to, or I will argue how this sense of honor relates to the moral sense in the British tradition, and how these two pillars come together in Jacobi's thinking. So in the second edition of Spinoza Letters from 1789, Jacobi includes many appendices and develops some ideas that were just suggested in the first edition or were actually absent. An interesting part of the preface is called Concerning Man's Freedom, which was afterwards renamed as Preliminary Propositions about Man's Constraint and Freedom in the 1819 edition. And this was the last one of actually the fourth volume from Jacobi's works. Essentially, this text is a comparison between two coexisting, although opposed characteristics of man, freedom, and mechanical necessity. In the 35th and 36th proposition of the first part, Jacobi explains that the Stoics always distinguish between the principle of desire and the principle of honor. On the first case, men are only slaves living in accordance with the law of things, so according to pleasure. And on the second case, there is true freedom. Its object is the perfection of human nature and its autonomous activity. That is why the Stoics, I quote Jacobi, would quite rightly only allow a man to be called free who lived just the life of his soul and determined himself according to the laws of his nature, hence only obeyed himself and always acted on his own, the end of quotation. So this feeling of honor is the manifestation of moral unconditioned judgments. Now, this is an expression from Jacobi, of the moral feeling that judges without reasons and exists in an apodetic manner. This is also a formulation from Jacobi. A very important etymological note is needed. The formulation feeling of honor or nobility, Gefühl der Ehre, depending on the translation of Ehre, is attributed to the Stoics, to Epictetus and Marcus Aurelius, but it seems somewhat out of place because this expression does not appear in either of the two Roman Stoics. However, a more plausible possibility, and that's what I investigated, is that it was actually borrowed from Cicero, especially from an extract of the book on laws, which Jacobi quotes in his letter to Fichte. In book 154, Marcus, this book 154 on laws from Cicero, Marcus speaks as arbiter between the Old Academy and Zeno, that is between Peripatetics and Stoics. And he says, the Old Academy decided that everything in accordance with nature was good if it helped us in life, while Zeno thought nothing good that was not also honorable, the end of quotation. The Latin word for honorable is honestum. The German word Ehre, or honor, comes from the Latin words honus and decus. Honus, or honor, is the common etymon that forms honestus and honoratus, honest and honored. And decus, on the other hand, is a synonym of decet, which means to conform or to be convenient, and comprises the noun decorum, also translated in English as propriety, and the adjective decorus. But where do I really want to go with this? I would like to talk about the sense of decorum or propriety and honesty, which is central to Cicero's ethics, and show how these two concepts undergo a transformation in the British moral philosophy until it becomes what we call the moral sense. In his book on duties from Cicero, book 1, Cicero explains the meaning of decorum or propriety as such. What is decorous, proper, is morally good or honest, and what is morally good or honest is decorous. This propriety, decorum, therefore, of which I'm speaking, this is a quotation from Cicero, this decorum of which I'm speaking belongs to each division of moral rectitude, and its relation to the cardinal virtues is so close that it is perfectly self-evident and does not require any abstruse process of reasoning to see it. End of quotation. I will now discuss the second text that I mentioned before, in which the influence of the British moral school on Jacobi is most evident, or I take to be most evident. I am talking about the dialogue between Voldemar and Sidney in the romance Voldemar. Voldemar is the main character of the romance, and Sidney is presented as a disciple of Adam Ferguson, the British author, philosopher. The two, Sidney and Voldemar, immediately feel a great affinity, and Voldemar declares that Ferguson's essay on history of civil society played an important role in his life and made him resume his study of the ancients. Sidney also names Thomas Reid as one of his teachers, and he praises his ideas on human understanding and human will. Both authors provide a hint to connect the sense of honor attributed to the Stoics to the moral feeling, and they also reveal how these two concepts are articulated in Jacobi's own ethical discussion. In Reid's work, we find the assimilation of Cicero's sensus rectis et honesti to the moral sense, or to the moral faculty or conscience. They're all synonyms. He explains that the word sense was probably chosen by analogy with the external senses, which are, according to Reid, the immediate testimonies of nature. Only through this moral faculty do we have the original conception of right and wrong in human behavior. Hence, such as the external senses are the immediate first principles of the material world, the moral sense constitutes the immediate first principles of the moral world. This means that the principles of the moral sense and the external senses are perceived both immediately and without reasoning. As such, not only morals, but the sciences as well must be built on such self-evident, indemonstrable certainty. And I quote now Thomas Reid, his book, his essays on the active powers of man. There he writes, "The faculties which nature has given us are the only engines we can use to find out the truth. We cannot indeed prove that those faculties are not fallacious unless God should give us new faculties to sit in judgment upon the old. But we are born under a necessity of trusting them." End of quotation. As well as for Reid, for Jacobi, the immediate certainty of belief is the foundation of nature and morality, or the supernatural world. It is in this spirit that Jacobi plays with the words "to lose sense is to fall into folly." In German, it says "von Sinnen kommen" und wahnsinnig werden. But Jacobi very rarely uses this word sense. He replaces it with instinct. He uses instinct instead of sense. Virtue is the specifically human instinct, and like all instincts, acts blindly, that is, before experience and without the intermediation of reasoning. According to him, to Jacobi, actions of benevolence and justice are motivated with no other intention than the satisfaction of the impulse itself and do not function as a means to an end. Therefore, as a fundamental impulse or Grundtrieb, the realization of virtue is man's true destiny. To understand how this moral sense can be an immediate truth and the foundation of all moral actions, I need to rewind the thread of history a bit further and talk about Francis Hutcheson. Hutcheson was a reference for the entire Scottish school of moral philosophy. He was one of the British philosophers who most clearly conceived the moral sense as a reinterpretation of the Ciceronian sensus decori et honesti, from which he developed an anti-legalistic morality and fought the selfish morality of authors like Thomas Hobbes. This so-called sense of right and wrong is also called moral sense or conscience. In absolute opposition to this line of thinking, Hutcheson argues that the sense of advantage associated with self-interest could never engender the feeling of public good deeply engraved in man's constitution, but it would only engender the feeling of a good for us or personal benefit, which would never make us approve of actions that promote the happiness of others. The moral sense is described so by Hutcheson as an universal benevolent instinct and not an innate idea. It is a kind of indemonstrable hidden quality. I quote Hutcheson, "It's some secret sense which determines our approbation without regard to self-interest." End of quotation. And its principle is benevolence, in which that Ciceronian sense of decorum and honesty is manifested, and it enables judgment of moral good or evil without reasoning or syllogism. Hutcheson uses the same formulation as Cicero in his Latin work, Philosophia Moralis Institutio Compendiaria, that is, sensus decorum pulchrum et honestum. Sense denotes any faculty or power that precedes all opinion and reasoning, so that it is enough to look into our hearts to find benevolence. Virtue, in turn, is actually desired for itself, so it does not depend on the deity's promise of punishment or reward, nor on education, instruction, or customs. Those play an important role in man's development, but they are not the cause of virtue. So, like the law of attraction, moral sense and benevolence are universally valid for all men. The common configuration of human nature itself is responsible for the agreement in moral judgments, for a kind of language of feeling understood by all. And this proves that man was destined to action by nature. So the moral law only serves to counterbalance a moral sense that it's already weakened by self-interest. So what is interesting here is that the law is not the foundation of virtue, and and actually benevolence does not depend on it. The anti-legalistic, what I call an anti-legalistic aspect of moral sense is very important to Jacobi as well. But the most important feature of the moral sense is actually that it is a guide to life, that Stoic ruling principle called hegemonikon, and it is immediately perceived from its very nature. This is the supreme good, according to Hutcheson. It's not a means to an end, but desired by itself. For Hutcheson, really much in line with Jacobi, the ultimate good is in God, and the moral sense is actually the organ of man's intimate connection with him, from which selfless love or pure love in Jacobian vocabulary arises. It is this moral sense that shows us the existence of a creator. It's not a proof or something theoretical, but it's the moral sense that shows us the existence of God. So I found no reference whatsoever, and I really looked for it, that Jacobi read Hutcheson. So I assume that he didn't. But his indirect influence is certainly present through the key authors that Jacobi read and really appreciated, such as, for instance, the Bishop Joseph Butler, Ferguson himself, Thomas Reid, David Hume, and Adam Smith. And Adam Smith was actually Hutcheson's student in Glasgow. So it's assumed it's safe to assume that these ideas indirectly were also known from Jacobi himself. So the morality of pure interest or self-love can be called a mechanical or causal morality that does not produce disinterest virtue, since everything is explained in terms of avoiding an evil, aversion, or preserving some good. This is the appetite. This is mechanical morality is a formulation from Jacobi. And this is the position of many philosophers, such as Hobbes and Descartes himself, but also and especially of Spinoza. Spinoza rejects any final cause, and for that reason, he must explain human action through an entirely mechanical ethic. In his system, there is no disinterest action, because the very possibility of a disinterest action presupposes the absence of a causal series that determines the action. As it is well known, in Spinozism, every action is determined by an efficient cause. So passions like love, hate, joy or sadness, satisfaction, and so on, are only molds from aversion and appetite. So in this sense, Spinoza claims to be able to deal with passions according to the geometric method, considering, I quote Spinoza, human actions and appetites exactly as if they were a matter of lines, planes, and bodies. End of quotation. He adds that all ideas we have of bodies indicate the current state of our body rather than the nature of an outer body. In this self-referential ethics, the object of love or hate is referred to the individual because there is no positive good or evil in things themselves. Good or evil are just ways of thinking, notions that arise from the comparison between things, since one and the same thing can be good or bad at the same time and still be indifferent. So good and evil relate only to the individual, or in other words, to the preservation of one's own existence. We call good something that contributes to the conservation of our being, and evil something that hinders its conservation. Good is something that affects us with joy, and evil something that affects us with sadness, for instance. This ethics is therefore based on utility. And that's what Spinoza himself says. And I quote him again, the more each one seeks what is useful to him, that is, the more he strives to preserve his being and is capable of doing so, the more he's endowed with virtue. End of quotation. And it is clear then that the absence of the capacity to exist by itself, only God is a true substance in Spinozism, and the absence of final causes forces Spinoza to locate the greatest possible virtue in the maintenance of our own existence, or in the conatus. And I quote Spinoza again, the effort to preserve oneself is the first and only foundation of virtue. Indeed, no other principle can be conceived that is first in relation to this one, and without it, no virtue can be conceived. End of quotation. So the relationship between self-preservation and utility is even clearer in Jacobi's explanation of Spinozism. And I quote now Jacobi talking about what is actually for him the relation between body and the concepts of things. Jacobi says, since the soul is nothing but the immediate concept of the body and is one and the same thing as the body, the excellence of the soul also cannot be anything but the excellence of its body. End of quotation. So in short, the ancient moral good is reduced to a natural good produced by the mechanism of efficient causes. This is what Jacobi has in view in his first part of the text concerning man's freedom, in the first part where man has no freedom. He recognizes, Jacobi recognizes an instinctive aspect of self-preservation, but this mechanism is not enough. It is actually not the domain of freedom nor of morality. So having briefly retraced this story of the concept of these concepts, it is actually, I think, easy to see the role such thoughts played in Jacobi's intellectual development. The philosophical novel Voldemar is a defense of the moral sense in its different features and a total rejection of selfishness or legalistic morals and unconditional law. Hoarnish, another character in the novel, is the defender of this type of morality. And in the same conversation between Sidney and Voldemar, he mocks both of them, replying that the discussion on virtue and religion has nothing to do with feeling. For him, these concepts must always show the same consistency, and they must teach to disdain the doubtful help of the heart. Men must determine themselves only by reason, he says. In defense of the moral sense against this pure law, Sidney compares Voldemar to the English Bishop Joseph Butler. He claims that Butler was the first among the new moralists who exposed the human faculty to approve or reject our own actions and the actions of others internally, that is, without any reference to external good or bad effects of actions. So the action for itself. He was the first to state the existence of a moral faculty capable of judging right and wrong, good and evil, the propriety or impropriety of actions without reference to an end or an external effect. In fact, I suppose Jacobi was unaware that the author of these ideas are actually Shaftesbury and Hutcheson, which were widely read by Joseph Butler himself. But he doesn't mention Shaftesbury nor Hutcheson, so I assume that he didn't know this origin. Only the heart can say what is good, so speculation can only say what is useful. In other words, the heart is the destination of man and true joy in the highest good. Speculative and instrumental reason, what Jacobi actually calls understanding, finds only the means to worldly happiness. I quote the journal from Jacobi that was just released last year. This is actually a note from Jacobi, and it's in French, and the original is in French. So I quote, "The only true reason is the basis of everything. It is honor, it is freedom itself, but it resides much more in the heart than in the spirit. That who says, I have honor, says, I'm free." End of quotation. So I come to the conclusion. The relationship between utility of speculative reason and morality of feeling is equivalent to the relationship between understanding and true reason. For Jacobi, true reason is only moral and practical, not speculative. It is the moral organ itself. This conception implies giving a new meaning to the word reason and a new sense to the word understanding. So understanding is actually the faculty of finding the means to an end, not the faculty that provides the ends. Hence, I quote Jacobi, the understanding performs the best or the worst ends with the same diligence. End of quotation. So understanding compares and calculates. I quote Jacobi again, only reason reveals the highest good. It is the ability to presuppose the highest. End of quotation. So that's what the ancients called wisdom. Understanding is, on the other hand, is the intelligence that shows us what is useful. So what I need to say is that both understanding and reason, or understanding and the heart, must necessarily be united. After all, I quote Jacobi again, it is impossible that pure and clear understanding is incompatible with sublime reason. On the contrary, used correctly, both should foster each other. The problem, end of quotation, the problem lies in the imbalance when the progress of understanding or science takes itself to be the only right path and imposes a mechanical morality, suppressing the moral sense or true reason, the heart. Furthermore, like Cicero and Hutcheson, Jacobi wants to emphasize that the value of an age or of a man, a person, lies in his concrete actions, in his living example, and not in his doctrines or systems. And that is why, just to say something about what has been said already, that's why you can separate Spinoza, the author, from Spinoza, the man. And that's this, I think it's really an interesting topic. So thank you very much. That was all I had to say.
Okay, thank you very much, Juliana. So I hand over to Stefan again.
Okay, thank you so much for your talk, which was highly interesting. I learned a lot. One thing, if you look, there is this catalog of Jacobi's library where you can find this list of books he had. And he had, from Hutchinson, he had the essay on the nature and conduct of passions and affect. He had the inquiry into the origin of our ideas of beauty and the system
really?
of moral
Thank
philosophy.
you. No, that's really nice because I didn't have the. I was in Germany when I was studying this, but I didn't have access to this book. So thank you very much. This really helps my thesis.
And he also had Shaftesbury. I think it was a German translation of some collected works of Shaftesbury. So you are completely right that he had these ideas. One thing which might be interesting. So this idea of this moral sense or moral instinct goes back to the concept of synderesis from the Middle Ages, which is part of conscience, not conscientia, but synderesis. And there are which is interesting, I think, for your interpretation, because it makes up a systematic difference or more options. So there is this one idea held by Aquinas that synderesis is some sort of cognitive habit of certain moral fundamental propositions. And then there is this other theory held by Bonaventure, Jean Gerson, and later by John Calvin, that it's an instinct of the will. So Jean Gerson speaks of the undestroyable instinct or our natural impulse to seek the good and to obey natural law. Bonaventure speaks of a natural drive or impulse to do good, and Calvin also. So I think this is what Jacobi has in mind. It's not like we have some original judgments like this has to be done, this has to be avoided, but it's like a drive of our will which always drives us to good. And there is this other discussion in the Middle Ages whether these laws are only general, like good has to be done, bad deeds have to be avoided, or if there are specific laws. And I think that Jacobi always only speaks about a drive to do good, to become more perfect. So it seems in a way very abstract what this instinct goes to. It doesn't tell us that it's better to betray my friend than my wife or something. I don't know. So here comes something, I think, into play, which you didn't mention, but which is kind of important for Jacobi in his ethics. Namely, he said the best thing in his Voldemar is his presentation of Aristotle's ethics, not of the British or English moralists, but Aristotle. And he always quotes these things like to be just means to act as or like the just man acts, which this famous quotations from Aristotle. And I think this is very important. And I am not sure if you, in your interpretation, if you do not identify Jacobi too much with Voldemar. And because Hornig, I think he's not as bad as he is presented by Voldemar, because Hornig makes this prediction that Jacobi's Voldemar's good heart will be perverted and turn into demonic heart and evil heart. He will become satanic. And this is exactly what will happen to Voldemort in the end, that he will become like a devil or Satan. He's very mean to his friends, to his wife. And so I think that it's not so easy to identify Jacobi with Voldemort, but that Jacobi, Voldemort and Honig too, they both have in a way aspects which are completely fine, but they in a way put these aspects as the absolute. So Voldemort thinks, okay, there's only subjective feelings. And Honig says, no, 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 there's only laws and in a way what society says and things. And I think that Jacobi thinks both are, he's very Hegelian, I think, in this. Yeah, both are right, but because they think that their truth is the absolute truth, they are also wrong, because the heart is nothing without objectivity, and the objectivity of morals is nothing without the heart. And so both in a way fail. Honig fails his daughter, and Voldemort fails his friend. And I think the most interesting person, which is also interesting that it's a woman in the 18th century literature, is Alvina, the wife of Voldemort, because she is like someone who has both heart and is also in a way accepts objective morals. So I think that she is more the ideal of morality and not Voldemort. I think he's not so much the ideal. Yeah, but these are just some annotations and some thoughts I had while reading your paper, which was really fun. Thank you so much for sending it to me.
Thank you, Herr Schick. Yeah, you're absolutely right. I think Voldemort is not the example. I should have said that in my thesis. I write a little bit about it, that Jacobi cannot be confused with the characters, because there are characters in a romance. So it's not only him. But I thought that this dialogue is actually a dialogue that is. He writes it in, I think, in the second, or not the second edition, but in 1796. So, and he writes in a letter, I don't remember to whom, I think it's to Reinhold, and he says that that's the only part that you need to read in from Voldemort, from this new edition, and not and you don't need to read the whole book or the whole romance again. And I thought it was interesting because it was something new that wasn't there before in the first edition or in the first drafts. So I don't think Voldemort is the ideal, and I think too that Jacobi has this kind of dual position, so that the heart is not the absolute, or the feeling cannot be absolute and everything, because we don't go anywhere only with the feeling. So that's why I think it's really interesting to look at the British, because at the British Enlightenment, because there is this idea from Cicero that as a faculty that knows how to judge right and wrong, but how we judge right and wrong, or good and evil, is actually something personal, because it depends on the person. And that's why I think for the example, the actions of the person for Jacobi are very, very important, and that's why he doesn't really have a moral theory or a moral treatise, I would say. So at the end, for instance, from David Hume, he quotes the romance from was it Gertrude, and I don't know how it was called, but the romance was like from Spalding, and it was actually this, because the example, the life of the person is that it's what shows how his actions should be valued, and the actual life and the example. So I think it's interesting how we can combine these two, and what he calls reason and heart and understanding, because we do need the useful, the not the practical, but the useful things that the understanding helps us to achieve. So I think it is this duplicity that complements itself. but I thought that the British helped us to think of this moral sense not as something like purely abstract or without any sense, if you can say so. So it's I think it's interesting to retrace these ideas, but it's really experimental, I would say. And this is an interpretation, and I thank you very much for this reference on Hutchison and Shaftesbury from Jacobi's library, from Jacobi's books. And so about Aristotle, I didn't mention Aristotle. It's the main author now when it comes to Jacobi's ethics, and that people, all commentaries are based on. And I didn't mention because of it, because I think many things were just said about the relationship between Aristotle and Jacobi. But you are right. Maybe it's better to mention it just to actually to give this other account of how Jacobi interprets ethics. But I don't know if I answered, but thank you very much for your comments.
Okay, thank you very much, Juliana, again, and also Stefan for his comments. Yes, so, and I'm sorry that we're running a bit late, but I think it would be good if we now open the floor to everyone who would like to ask a question to any of the speakers. So if you want, you can use the raise hand icon. So I'm sure that some of you have questions. Don't hesitate to be the first. If there are no immediate questions, I would like, there is one, Pavel, please go ahead.
Thanks very much. So thanks very much to everybody for their talks. I have a question about something that came up in Wylon's paper and then in the discussion with Stefan. So the meaning of fatalism and determinism and the relation between those two, because the thought that there are no future contingencies or that every effect is determined by an antecedent cause seems to be determinism more generally, at least on how I understand it. And then fatalism is one species of that, when everything is determined not by mechanical causes, but by providence. And hence then for that kind of fatalism, you would need a super sensible being or some kind of God. And I remember that Jacobi does mention determinism. So my question is for both of you or for everybody, does he ever distinguish between determinism and fatalism in this way?
Yeah, thanks for the question. From what I have read from Jacobi so far, I have not come across a clear distinction between Jacobi's use of fatalism and determinism. So at least maybe I can say that at least not within the first edition of the Letters on Spinoza. But for the other works by Jacobi that I am going to study for my doctoral project, I am sure that I would be able to find some hints from other works by Jacobi on this issue. But I also suspect that maybe the philosophers at the time of Jacobi didn't really draw a clear distinction between fatalism and determinism. Yeah, I suspect that they consider it as roughly the same ideas.
I think Kant does draw that distinction. This is where it's coming to me from. I think in the third critique, perhaps elsewhere, he distinguishes determinism, this mechanistic kind of determinism, from fatalism, which requires providence. So maybe Jacobi makes a sense.
So the term fatalism comes up in Aristotle in his De Interpretatione, when this famous example with the sea battle, whether tomorrow there will be a sea battle. And this, I think this is commonly called logical fatalism. And I think people refer to it as logical fatalism. And I think that Aristotle in De Interpretatione refers to it as fatalism. So whether there is possibility at all, or isn't. So we have this truth values, whether it's true or not, to say tomorrow there will be a sea battle. And if it is true, it has to be true no matter. So if I say yesterday there was a sea battle, this is true today. This is also true today. But if we have this tomorrow sea battle, and I say, today I say this, tomorrow there is a sea battle in somewhere, then is this true or is it false? And then comes these logical solutions by Aristotle, and usually authors refer to it as fatalism. So fatalism is not only this, I don't know, the Nornen who have this, who do something in heaven, or can also be this logical fatalism, which to which Aristotle refers to.
And Marlijn, would you like to respond to this, or?
Maybe I can add something about the historical aspect as well. Since Pavel mentioned the third critique of Kant, in which he touches upon the difference between fatalism and determinism. I dare to say that the third critique was written in. It's definitely after 1790, I guess.
In 1790.
1790. So Hamsterhuis's letter on fatalism was in 1776, or 79, if I remember correctly. And then the letters on Spinoza in 1785, and then Kant's third critique in 1790. So maybe before 1790, fatalism was a rather generic term, a rather general term that the philosophers used to denote the idea that things were already planned or predetermined for us.
Yeah, that makes sense.
Mm-hmm.
Thanks.
Okay, good point. Louise, please.
Thanks. So thank you for all of your presentations. And my question is to Juliana, and good to see you, first of all. And second, I really liked your presentation. It was very enlightening, and it gives a lot of content to this, realm of heart in Jacobi, which is very difficult to understand sometimes. And since I know that you've worked also on Jacobi's approach to philosophy, I was just wondering how you see the relationship between these two realms. Is philosophy more related to the heart? Is philosophy more related to the understanding? Does Jacobi try to connect them, and how does he try to connect them? And do you see a path for the construction of a philosophy in Jacobi connecting both realms? And so, yeah.
Hi, Luis.
Hi.
Good to see you too. Thank you for the question. And yeah, it was actually the attempt of my thesis to say that Jacobi does have a philosophy of his own, and not only a critique of reason or a critique of philosophy of others. And it's really difficult to explain it. The way I found personally to explain it, or to understand what he does mean by his philosophy, that he actually calls Unphilosophie, oder Wissendes Nichtwissen. How do you translate it in English? Not knowledge, not knowing. I don't know. I don't know how you translate it in English, but Wissendes Nichtwissen is actually good. I think you all understand it. So what I try to think in the thesis, in my thesis, is actually how the moral part and the more theoretical ones, so to speak, come together, and how they relate. And I think Jacobi offers us the idea of men as a double, or as as something dualistic. So we cannot unite or synthesize the heart and the reason, he calls heart the revelation, and the understanding, the speculation, and so on. So what he proposes is that we cannot unite these two, because if we did, we would actually be or dogmatic, or we would be, I don't know, Hegel, or we would be Schelling, or everyone tried in a way to synthesize or to unite both reality and ideality, or real and ideal. Right? So what I think Jacobi tries to say is that we don't need to, and we don't have to do it to have a philosophy. The philosophy must not be the union of these two realms, in the sense that the understanding will actually be able to explain or to translate the heart in this sense. And I think, I don't know if I'm clear, but I think it's difficult because English is not really a great language for me. But I don't know if you understood it. So I think the same way he says we need an immediate principle of knowledge, of the sciences and so forth, the certainty of the first hand, how he puts it to Mendelssohn. We do need the same principle in morality, and at the end they are the heart, the reason itself. So that's why he transforms the meaning of reason at some point, and he says at the end, okay, I thought as everyone else since Aristotle that reason was actually just a potentialization of understanding, but it was actually not the same thing and not this. So I found out that reason is actually the organ of revelation, the heart, the feeling, or the Glauben, the belief. So that's in the preface of David Hume, of the last edition of David Hume. So I think it's something in this way, but I don't know if I answered.
Maybe we turn to Luciano first.
Yeah.
Yeah. Hi. Thanks to Juliana, Wailam, Guido, and Stefan for the presentations and the comments. I had a question for Guido. I was wondering about something that it's more like a clarification about something you came to right at the end of the presentation. So the comparison between Descartes and Jacobi in Hegel's Vorbegriff, and to what extent it is justified or not. And I was wondering, because on one hand you pointed out that Jacobi appreciated and of course developed this idea that in the Beweisgrund that there is a kind of immediate access to the proposition, there is a God. At the same time, you also pointed out that in a way Jacobi accepts the proof that Kant gives, so not just this immediate grasp, but the argument that Kant develops, which is not a very immediate argument. I mean, it's a kind of developed proof and so on. And so I was wondering, to what extent, let's say, Hegel's claim that Jacobi is, let's say, has this idea of immediate knowing. I mean, of course, there are other reasons why Hegel says this, but let's say if we focus on this point, how do you see, let's say, Hegel's criticism or Hegel's, let's say, claim? And let's say a related point would be if Hegel is right in classifying, let's say, Jacobi and Descartes as, let's say, in this category, in this third position, would this also mean that the pre-critical Kant would have to fall into this third genus? I mean, of course, it's over Kant philosophy. We can say it's pre-critical. We don't have to care about it because Kant himself, let's say, liquidated it. But let's say, for the sake of argument, how do you see this? Thank you.
Okay, thank you, Luciano. Nice to see you again. Well, I think Hegel's point is exaggerated. I wouldn't say that Jacobi and Descartes make the same point concerning knowledge, nor that they make the same point concerning immediate knowledge, because intuition for Descartes is very different from what Jacobi calls intuition, both in ethics and concerning metaphysical objects, so to speak. Just to name one thing, Descartes doesn't think that intuition and deduction are two different things. He thinks that intuitions are, so to speak, compressed deduction. It is a deduction from premises to conclusions that one can recall in mind in a simple grasp and says, okay, I see it whole, I see the whole. And so, and this is nothing to do with Jacobi's point, which is always dualistic. It opposes intuitions and concepts, or intuitions and discursivity. So on this score, Hegel's point is wrong. On the other hand, I would not say that it is completely wrong, in the sense that it grasps something concerning the relationship of Jacobi with modern metaphysical rationalism, which is not as, I think, at least, not as straightforward as Jacobi presents it. I think that there are many ambivalences. If one think of Descartes also beyond the problem of the ontological proof, Jacobi also says that Descartes was wrong in starting with the cogito. One must begin with the sum, not with the cogito. But he also says that he is a true Cartesian while many others are not anymore. So I would think that the problem of the relationship of Jacobi with Descartes is quite elusive, and the ontological proof is one point that I tried to make in this ambivalence. With respect to your question about Kant in the Beweisgrund says that the belief in the existence of God doesn't need any speculation. Speculation does harm, because it blurs clear distinctions and clear judgments that sound common judgments as already in itself, and so we does not need metaphysics as Descartes thinks to ascertain that God exists. He also says that there is a metaphysical need to explain what one believes, and this need is legitimate once we grant that once we establish what a sound metaphysical explanation is. It is not a mathematical synthesis of concepts. It is an analysis, Kant says in the Beweisgrund, not the critical Kant, of course. It is an analysis of simple concepts, simple judgments, better, that we have in our common sense grasp of things. So from this point of view, I don't think that there is an alternative in Kant between an immediate judgment about the existence of God and an ontological proof. It has to be an ontological proof of a certain kind. It cannot be the a priori proof of Descartes, but a more indirect argument which employs modal categories, which is what Leibniz tried to do. The problem is that Leibniz also thought that he was simply explaining Descartes. So it's not easy to track the discontinuities and the continuities in this history. My point concerning Jacobi is that I think that there is something similar. I don't think that Jacobi simply says, okay, we have a God in Gefühl, and that's it. he employs a variety of arguments which are related especially to our practical understanding of ourselves and of the world, not to our theoretical understanding. That's true, I agree, but these are arguments, so they employ concepts. And so what kind of arguments are they? Are they similar to Kant's? Maybe, maybe not. I think they are. And so this is I don't know if I clarified the points I made. I cannot answer to the position of the pre-critical Kant in the Vorbegriff. Maybe it would be in the third position. I don't know. I really don't know. Maybe you have a better idea on this.
Okay, so Luciano, I'm sorry, but I think that in view of the time, it would be better to formally conclude the session here. But then I see that Juliana also has a question, so please stay on for further conversations. But I think it's good to mark this moment and to thank all speakers, and of course also Stefan for his very interesting contributions. I think it was a very inspiring discussion, and that the various talks had many points of connection. So for those who have to go, we hope to see you next time. And for those who want to stay on, please feel free to do so.
Thank you very much.